Miami Beach, December 1943. The luxury hotels lining Collins Avenue stood like pastel monuments to a peacetime America that seemed increasingly distant. Their Art Deco facades gleamed in the tropical sun, their lobbies filled with marble and chrome, their rooms outfitted with amenities that spoke of comfort and prosperity. German submarine officers, freshly captured from the Battle of the Atlantic, stepped out of military transports and stared in disbelief at what they assumed could only be an elaborate ruse. They had been taught that America was a failing nation, crippled by the Great Depression, its people starving, its industry collapsing under the weight of capitalist excess. The reality before their eyes made no sense whatsoever. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these prisoners were about to experience would shatter every certainty they had carried into captivity, transforming their understanding not just of their enemy, but of everything they had been told about the world beyond their homeland. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann had commanded U-Boat 512 for 18 months before depth charges from an American destroyer forced his crew to surface approximately 120 nautical miles east of Cape Hatteras. He was 28 years old, a product of rigorous training, and absolutely convinced that his nation was engaged in an existential struggle against powers that sought to destroy European civilization. He had been responsible for sinking 7 merchant vessels totaling 42,000 tons. He had watched men struggle in the cold Atlantic waters. He had believed with complete certainty that every action he took served a righteous cause. The bus ride from the port to what his captors called the processing center took 40 minutes through landscape that challenged everything he thought he knew. Hartmann sat in silence, watching palm trees flash past the windows, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he knew must be true. The roads were paved and well-maintained, stretching for miles without potholes or damage. Civilians drove automobiles that looked new, not cobbled together from spare parts or converted from military vehicles. Shops displayed goods in their windows, real merchandise, not empty displays designed to create illusions of prosperity. People walked without the haunted look he had seen in European cities, their faces showing contentment, even cheerfulness. Children played in parks that were maintained and clean. Everything looked prosperous, peaceful, normal in ways that defied every propaganda briefing he had ever received. Then the bus turned onto Collins Avenue, and Hartmann felt his certainty begin to crack in ways he would not have thought possible just hours earlier. The McAlpin Hotel rose 7 stories, its streamlined facade painted in cream and turquoise, horizontal speed lines emphasizing its sleek modernity. Porthole windows dotted the upper floors, circular openings that evoked ocean liners and suggested movement even in stillness. The lobby, visible through glass doors that seemed impossibly large and clear, featured terrazzo floors in geometric patterns, curved reception desks made from exotic woods, and lighting fixtures that looked like something from a science fiction novel. American guards escorted Hartmann and 32 other German officers through doors that opened automatically, a technological flourish that seemed almost insulting in its casual display of advancement, as though such mechanisms were so common that even a building housing prisoners warranted their installation. This had to be a trick. This had to be propaganda. This had to be psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, captured from U-Boat 237 after a prolonged depth charge attack in the Caribbean, voiced what everyone was thinking as they stood in the lobby that seemed too beautiful, too perfect, too intentionally designed to overwhelm their expectations. His voice carried an edge of desperate certainty, as though saying the words aloud would make them true and restore the world to something recognizable. They are trying to demoralize us. This is psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. They have created a facade, a Potemkin village to make us doubt everything we know. These buildings are probably empty shells beyond what we can see. The food will be terrible once we are settled. The conditions will be harsh once the cameras stop recording. They want us to see this luxury and then break us with the reality. It is clever, I admit. Very clever. But we are not so easily fooled. We know what we are fighting for. An American lieutenant colonel named Robert Harrison oversaw the facility. He was 43 years old, a career officer who had spent the 1930s stationed in various posts across the United States, and he understood something about human psychology that would prove far more effective than any interrogation technique ever devised. He stood before the assembled prisoners and spoke in fluent German, learned during a posting in Berlin in 1936, before the world had caught fire, and nations that had once traded peacefully now sought each other's destruction. "Gentlemen, you are now prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law and the customs of warfare between civilized nations. Your quarters are upstairs. Meals are served 3 times daily in the dining room, according to a schedule you will receive. You may use the recreational facilities, including the swimming pool, the library, and the common areas. You will receive mail and may send letters home through the International Red Cross. You may attend religious services conducted by chaplains of your faith. You are officers, and you will be treated with the respect your rank commands." The prisoners exchanged glances, skeptical, waiting for the other shoe to drop, certain that the trap would reveal itself soon enough. Hartmann was assigned to room 412 on the 4th floor. He climbed the stairs, refusing to use the elevator because that would be accepting the charade, participating in their psychological game. The hallway was clean, well lit, carpeted in patterns that absorbed footfalls and created an atmosphere of quiet dignity. He inserted the key into the lock, turned it, pushed open the door, and stopped completely still for several long seconds. The room contained 2 beds with actual mattresses, not straw pallets or thin pads laid on wooden frames. Clean white sheets that smelled of soap and sunshine, pillows encased in crisp cotton, a private bathroom with running hot water, a toilet that flushed, a sink with separate taps for hot and cold, a shower with proper water pressure, a small desk positioned near the window to take advantage of natural light, 2 chairs upholstered in fabric that showed no wear, a window that opened onto a view of the ocean, the same Atlantic that had been his battlefield and was now simply beautiful water sparkling under subtropical sun, a ceiling fan that turned slowly, moving the warm air in gentle circulation. Everything was clean, maintained, functional, designed for comfort rather than mere survival. Hartmann stood in the doorway for a long moment, then walked to the bathroom and turned on the tap marked hot. Water flowed immediately, and within seconds, steam began to rise. He turned on the shower. Water pressure was strong and consistent, the kind of pressure that required good plumbing and reliable municipal water systems. He flushed the toilet. It worked perfectly, refilling quietly and efficiently. He examined the towels hanging on racks. They were thick, absorbent, recently laundered. "This is better than my quarters at home. This is better than any hotel I have ever seen in Hamburg or Berlin, or anywhere in Europe. This cannot be real. This cannot be what they give to prisoners. This cannot be standard procedure. There must be something we are not seeing, some purpose we do not yet understand." Dinner was served at 1800 hours in a dining room that had once hosted wealthy tourists seeking escape from northern winters. The prisoners filed in slowly, reluctantly, still half expecting the facade to crumble at any moment. The room's walls were decorated with murals of tropical scenes painted by artists who understood light and color. Its tables set with actual tablecloths in crisp white linen, its windows offering views of the beach and ocean beyond. American guards stood along the walls in relaxed postures, but they were not the brutal overseers that propaganda had promised. They looked bored, professional, occasionally chatting among themselves about matters that had nothing to do with the prisoners, as though guarding captured enemy officers was simply another duty assignment. The meal arrived on actual porcelain plates, not tin mess kits or wooden bowls. Roasted chicken, seasoned with herbs and cooked properly, so that meat fell cleanly from the bone. Mashed potatoes with gravy that had been made from real drippings, not artificial flavorings. Green beans that showed signs of having been fresh before cooking. Bread that was still warm from the oven, accompanied by real butter in quantities that seemed wasteful. A small salad with actual lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers, vegetables that had become luxuries in Europe. Coffee, real coffee with a rich aroma, not the ersatz grain mixture they had been drinking for years. Dessert was apple pie served with cream, a sweet indulgence that seemed to mock the rationing and scarcity that had defined their lives for so long. Hartman stared at his plate for several long seconds before beginning to eat. Around him men ate in silence, the only sound the clink of utensils against china and the occasional murmur as someone asked for items to be passed. This was more food than he had seen in a single meal in 2 years. This was food of a quality that had become a distant memory of peacetime dinners before the world changed. This was impossible, according to everything they had been taught about American weakness and economic collapse. After dinner, some men explored the facility with the tentative curiosity of people who expected to find evidence of deception behind every door. The library contained thousands of books in German, English, French, Spanish, and other languages, organized by subject and author, maintained by an American librarian who catalogued new acquisitions weekly. The recreation room had billiard tables with level playing surfaces and good cues, card tables where men could play bridge or chess, board games imported from before the conflict. The swimming pool was Olympic-sized, heated to comfortable temperatures year-round, maintained with chemical treatments that kept the water clear and sanitary. There were tennis courts outside with proper nets and line markers. A small theater showed films twice weekly, both American productions and captured German newsreels. Educational classes were available for those who wanted to continue their studies in subjects ranging from languages to mathematics to engineering. Richter stood by the pool, staring at the water that reflected overhead lights in gentle ripples, and finally said what they were all thinking but had been reluctant to voice aloud. Perhaps it is only this facility. Perhaps they have created this one showcase for propaganda purposes, and the other camps are different. Perhaps we were selected because we are officers, and they want to create division between us and enlisted men. This cannot be representative. This cannot be normal. This cannot be how they treat all prisoners. But as days became weeks, as weeks became months, the charade never broke. The food remained abundant, varied, nutritious. The quarters remained comfortable, clean, well-maintained. The treatment remained correct, even courteous, following not just the letter, but the spirit of international conventions. Guards learned prisoner names, engaged in small talk about weather and sports, shared cigarettes with men who had run out of their German tobacco rations. American officers discussed technical matters with their German counterparts about navigation and submarine design and tactical theory, not as victors gloating over the defeated, but as professionals with mutual respect for expertise and experience. The International Red Cross visited monthly on a regular schedule. Their reports confirmed that conditions exceeded the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention by substantial margins. Representatives interviewed prisoners without American guards present, inspected facilities without restrictions, examined records of food provision and medical care. They found no evidence of mistreatment, no signs of propaganda staging, no indication that the apparent prosperity was anything other than genuine. Letters from home began arriving with increasing regularity, and with them came news that painted a picture increasingly at odds with what prisoners had been told about the course of the conflict. Cities were being bombed, yes, but the American bombing campaign's scale suggested industrial capacity far beyond anything they had imagined possible. Families wrote of food shortages and rationing, but American mess halls threw away more food daily than entire German neighborhoods saw in a week, and this apparent waste was considered normal rather than scandalous. Reports from the Eastern Front suggested German forces were retreating, not advancing toward inevitable victory. The tone of letters from home shifted from confidence to worry to barely concealed desperation. In February 1944, new prisoners arrived from the European theater of operations. They brought stories of the Allied advance through Italy, of American equipment and supplies flooding into Britain in preparation for an invasion everyone knew was coming, of supply chains so robust that frontline troops had access to amenities that seemed wasteful by European standards. One Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over France during a reconnaissance mission, described American airfields that looked like small cities, with paved runways extending for thousands of meters, permanent buildings for everything from maintenance to administration to recreation, extensive support facilities that suggested logistics capacity beyond anything he had encountered. He had been stationed at airfields in Poland, where mechanics worked in tents and supplies came irregularly, if at all, where fuel was rationed, and spare parts were salvaged from damaged aircraft, where the contrast with American abundance was so stark, it seemed to represent different centuries of development rather than simply different nations. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for men who had built their identities around certain beliefs. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed with the certainty of absolute conviction, was contradicted by direct observation that could not be explained away. America was not weak. America was not failing. America was not even straining under the war effort in ways that suggested it was approaching its limits. America was so prosperous, so productive, so systemically efficient that it could house enemy prisoners in luxury hotels and feed them better than its own military personnel had been fed during peacetime. And this generosity was not extraordinary, but simply standard procedure applied consistently. Schneider had grown up in Bremen, where his father had worked in the shipyards building merchant vessels before the economy collapsed. He remembered the unemployment that had ravaged his neighborhood, the desperation that had driven families to extremes, the appeal of a movement that promised order and dignity and national revival. He remembered believing that they were the superior culture, the advanced civilization, the people who would reshape Europe into something glorious and eternal. He sat in the Miami Beach sunshine, eating fresh fruit that had been shipped from California orchards thousands of miles away, as though distance and logistics were trivial concerns, reading a newspaper printed on paper so abundant that it ran to 30 pages daily without anyone considering this wasteful, and felt the foundation of his entire worldview crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. We were told Americans were soft. We were told they loved comfort too much to fight effectively. We were told their mongrel society of mixed peoples could never match our discipline and unity and purpose. We were told they were in economic collapse, unable to feed their own people, desperate and weak. We were told everything that made us feel superior was true, and everything that suggested otherwise was enemy lies designed to demoralize us. But here we are, housed in their hotels, eating their abundant food, swimming in their pools, and they are not even trying very hard. This is not their maximum effort. This is not them straining every resource. This is them being casually generous to prisoners who tried to sink their ships and drown their sailors. What does that say about everything we believed? Hartmann had come to a similar realization, though it had taken him longer to articulate it even to himself. He was an officer, trained in strategy and operations, educated in the history of naval warfare and military theory. He understood logistics and industrial production and the mathematics of sustained conflict. He understood that wars were not won by courage alone, or by superior tactics, or by force of will, but by the capacity to produce, supply, and sustain military forces over extended periods while maintaining civilian support. He had believed that Germany's qualitative superiority in training and equipment and tactical doctrine would overcome any quantitative disadvantage. He had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the evidence was overwhelming and impossible to deny. In April 1944, the prisoners were allowed to form a symphony orchestra for cultural enrichment. Instruments were provided through arrangements with local music stores. Sheet music was obtained from publishers who donated materials for educational purposes. They performed concerts monthly for both prisoners and American personnel who attended voluntarily, not because they were ordered to demonstrate international friendship, but because they genuinely enjoyed classical music. Hartmann played violin, a skill learned in childhood from his mother who had taught music before marriage, and found himself sitting beside an American officer who played cello with considerable talent. The American was a professor of music from Yale University, commissioned during the conflict, and they discussed Bach and Beethoven and Brahms with the easy familiarity of shared passion that transcended national boundaries. After one rehearsal, the American officer mentioned casually that his university had more than 150 buildings spread across a campus, covering more than 200 acres, a library containing millions of volumes collected over centuries, laboratories equipped with the latest technology for scientific research, and an endowment that exceeded the gross domestic product of several European nations. He mentioned this not to boast or intimidate, but because Hartmann had asked about his teaching position and responsibilities, and the American assumed such details were common knowledge, the normal scale of American educational institutions. Hartmann did the mathematics in his head and realized that a single American university possessed resources that exceeded those available to entire German cities, and this university was only one of dozens of comparable institutions scattered across the country. By summer 1944, most prisoners had stopped discussing the conflict as though their side might prevail through some miracle or unexpected development. They discussed instead what would happen after the inevitable conclusion, how they would rebuild their shattered nation, what lessons could be learned from this catastrophic defeat. Some still clung to the old certainties with the desperation of men who had built their identities around beliefs they could not abandon without losing themselves, but their voices grew quieter as evidence mounted, and their arguments sounded increasingly hollow even to their own ears. Others embraced their transformation more readily, reading American civics textbooks and constitutional law and economic theory, trying to understand how such a system could function without the strong, centralized control they had believed was necessary for national success. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison watched this evolution with quiet satisfaction that he was careful never to express openly. He had not broken these men through cruelty or deprivation or sophisticated interrogation techniques. He had broken them through abundance, through consistent application of stated principles, through allowing them to observe reality without filters or propaganda. He had shown them the truth repeatedly, consistently, patiently, until their denial became impossible to sustain even for the most committed believers. He understood that some would carry this lesson home when the conflict ended, and some would reject it and return to comfortable lies. But seeds planted in fertile ground had a way of growing given time and proper conditions. The conflict in Europe ended in May 1945 with German surrender. Prisoners listened to radio broadcasts with mixed emotions that defied simple categorization. Relief that the destruction would stop, that their families might survive and rebuild. Grief for what had been lost, for friends who had perished, for a homeland that had been devastated. Shame for what their nation had done. Now that information about the concentration camps was becoming public knowledge, and the scale of atrocities could no longer be dismissed as enemy propaganda. Confusion about what came next, about how to reconcile their past beliefs with present realities, about who they would become in whatever world emerged from the ruins. Repatriation began in stages over the following months. Hartmann was among the last groups to leave, departing Miami Beach in November 1945 after 23 months as a prisoner. He had gained weight on American food. He had read extensively from the library, consuming hundreds of books on subjects ranging from American history to economics to political philosophy. He had learned English fluently through classes and constant practice with guards who were patient with mistakes. He had corresponded regularly with his family through Red Cross channels and learned that his hometown of Kiel had been heavily damaged by bombing raids, that his father had been injured during an air raid and would walk with a permanent limp, that the world he had known before the conflict was gone and would never return. The transport ship that carried repatriated prisoners back to Europe was crowded, uncomfortable, nothing like the accommodations they were leaving behind. Hartmann stood on deck as the American coastline disappeared behind them, watching the Art Deco hotels of Miami Beach shrink into the distance, and realized that he was returning to a country he no longer quite recognized, carrying ideas that would have been considered treasonous just 3 years earlier, transformed in ways he was still trying to understand. He thought about the Art Deco hotels with their streamlined facades and porthole windows, about the casual prosperity that permeated every aspect of American life, about Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had treated him with correctness and dignity even when it would have been easier to be cruel, about the music professor who had discussed Beethoven as though they were colleagues rather than enemies. He thought about the newspapers with their documentation of industrial output that seemed impossible, about the mess halls that threw away more food than entire families could eat in a week, about the swimming pools and libraries and educational programs provided to enemy prisoners as though such things were basic rights rather than extraordinary privileges. But the truth had set him free in ways he was only beginning to understand and would spend years exploring. Schneider stood beside him at the rail, watching the same horizon. They had become genuine friends during captivity, bound by shared experience and shared revelation, and the peculiar intimacy of men who had undergone transformation together. Schneider would return to Bremen and find his father's shipyard closed permanently, his neighborhood in ruins with rubble still being cleared months after the conflict's end, his former beliefs in ashes like the buildings that had once housed them. He would spend years rebuilding, physically and psychologically, trying to create something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. "Do you think they knew?" Schneider asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of waves against the hull. "Do you think they understood that treating us well would accomplish more than treating us badly? Do you think it was deliberate strategy or simply who they are as a people? Do you think they planned this transformation or did it happen naturally because of their values?" Hartmann considered the question carefully. He had asked himself the same thing many times during long nights in his comfortable Miami Beach hotel room, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile what he had experienced with what he had believed. Perhaps both. Perhaps they understood that showing us the truth was more effective than hiding it behind propaganda. Perhaps they simply believe in certain principles and apply them consistently regardless of circumstances. Perhaps it does not matter why they did it, only that they did, and we saw it, and we cannot unsee it. Perhaps the lesson is that systems based on truth and abundance and consistent principles are more powerful than systems based on lies and scarcity and expedient cruelty. Perhaps that is what we were supposed to learn. The ship plowed through grey Atlantic waters toward a continent that lay broken and defeated. Europe lay ahead, occupied by the very powers they had been taught to despise as inferior. The years ahead would be difficult, filled with hunger and hardship and the slow, painful work of reconstruction, both physical and psychological. But some of those returning carried within them seeds of ideas that might eventually help build something different, something better, something sustainable. The prisoners of conflict who had lived in Miami Beach's Art Deco hotels returned to tell a story that seemed absurd to those who had remained in Germany and experienced only defeat and deprivation. They spoke of abundance beyond imagination, of generous treatment that exceeded minimal requirements, of industrial capacity that operated at scales beyond European comprehension. Some were believed by family members and friends who saw the transformation in their eyes and manner. Many were dismissed as having been brainwashed by clever propaganda, their testimony rejected because it contradicted comfortable beliefs about American weakness. But the seed was planted, the idea that perhaps the enemy they had been taught to hate had something valuable to teach them about building a functional society. Hartmann would eventually become a teacher in Hamburg, educating a new generation about naval history, but also about critical thinking and the dangers of believing comfortable lies. He would speak carefully, aware that some topics remained sensitive in the years immediately following the conflict, but he would emphasize evidence-based reasoning, the importance of questioning what you are told even when it confirms what you want to believe, the value of direct observation over ideological certainty. His students would remember him as a man who chose his words carefully but spoke important truths. Schneider would work in reconstruction efforts, helping rebuild Bremen's shattered infrastructure from rubble and ruins. He would marry a woman who had survived the bombing raids, have children who would grow up in a different Germany, and tell them stories about the conflict that emphasized the lessons learned rather than the battles engaged. He would describe the Art Deco hotels of Miami Beach as a turning point, the moment when reality became impossible to deny, when transformation became inevitable. Across Germany, in the years after the conflict, thousands of former prisoners returned with similar stories. They had been held in camps scattered across America, from Florida to Texas to the Midwest to the West Coast. They had worked on farms during harvest seasons and in factories producing civilian goods under conditions that exceeded those of many civilian workers. They had been fed adequately by international standards, housed properly according to Geneva Convention requirements, treated according to laws that their own nation had violated routinely. They had seen an America that bore no resemblance to the propaganda images they had been shown during training and indoctrination. Their testimony contributed to a gradual shift in understanding that took years to fully manifest. The American system, whatever its flaws and contradictions, had produced results that could not be denied. Democracy, for all its messiness and apparent inefficiency, had proven more resilient than dictatorship when tested by total conflict. Abundance based on productive capacity had proven more sustainable than autarky based on conquest and extraction. Pluralism had proven stronger than enforced uniformity when mobilizing entire populations for sustained effort. These were not comfortable lessons for a defeated nation proud of its historical achievements, but they were lessons that, over time, helped shape a different path forward. The Art Deco hotels of Miami Beach eventually returned to civilian use as tourism resumed in the post-conflict years. They hosted tourists again, people seeking sunshine and relaxation and escape from northern winters, unaware that their comfortable rooms had once housed enemy officers who arrived expecting harsh treatment and discovered instead a truth that changed them forever. The buildings still stand today, preserved as historic landmarks valued for their architectural significance, their streamlined facades and porthole windows testament to an era when design embraced optimism about the future and technology's promise. Very few visitors who stroll past these elegant structures know that they once served as prisoner facilities, or that the treatment provided within their walls contributed to a psychological transformation as significant as any military victory achieved on battlefields. The story faded from public memory, becoming a footnote in the vast historical record of a global conflict, mentioned briefly in specialized academic works, but largely forgotten in popular understanding of the period. But for those who experienced it directly, for men like Hartmann and Schneider, and hundreds of others who lived in those Art Deco hotels for months or years, the memory remained vivid throughout their lives. They had arrived as true believers in an ideology that promised strength and glory and eternal dominance. They had left as skeptics who had seen a better alternative, who had experienced firsthand the power of systems built on different principles. They had expected psychological warfare designed to break their spirits and received instead something more powerful, the opportunity to observe reality without filters, to draw their own conclusions based on evidence rather than propaganda, to undergo genuine transformation through experience rather than coercion. The Art Deco hotels were not a trick designed to deceive. They were not propaganda carefully staged for enemy consumption. They were simply America being itself, applying its stated principles consistently even to enemies who had sought its destruction, and trusting that the truth would be more persuasive than any lie could ever be. In that trust, in that consistency between stated values and actual practice, lay a victory more profound and lasting than any battlefield triumph could achieve. The prisoners who returned to Germany carried within them the seeds of doubt about everything they had been taught, and from that doubt grew questions, and from those questions grew a willingness to consider different answers to fundamental questions about how societies should be organized. History rarely provides clean narratives or simple lessons that can be extracted and applied universally. The transformation of German prisoners in American captivity did not by itself reshape post-conflict Germany into something new. It was one thread among many in a complex tapestry of defeat, occupation, reconstruction, and eventual reconciliation. But threads matter, especially when woven together with others, and the testimony of returned prisoners contributed to a broader re-evaluation of what had gone wrong and how to build something better from the ruins. The young men who had commanded submarines and engaged in naval operations with absolute certainty in the righteousness of their cause became older men who taught their children to question authority, to think critically about claims made by governments and movements, to examine evidence before accepting conclusions, to be skeptical of grand promises and simple answers to complex problems. That legacy, quiet and undramatic, rippled forward through generations in ways that are difficult to measure, but nonetheless real. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. And check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.